President Cyril Ramaphosa has called for the lifting of sanctions against Zimbabwe. The United States, the European Union and the UK slapped several individuals in Zimbabwe with sanctions over 20 years ago. Ramaphosa was speaking at the United Nations General Assembly last night.
The sanctions that are also being applied against South Africa's neighbor, Zimbabwe, should also be lifted as they are imposing untold suffering on ordinary Zimbabweans, but also have a collateral negative impact on neighboring countries as well, such as my own country, South Africa. As many people around the world are confronted by hunger and want, the essential human qualities of cooperation and solidarity must be evident in the actions that we take to bridge the divide between the wealthy and the poor.
Ramaphosa also using his speech at the UN General Assembly last night to call on the US to lift sanctions against Cuba. US President John Fitzgerald Kennedy imposed sanctions against Cuba back in 1962. It's remained in place ever since. He got his brother to go and buy Cuban cigars just before he did it. In Zimbabwe, sanctions were imposed on then-President Robert Mugabe after he was accused of abusing human rights in that country. The situation in Zimbabwe has changed. Well, not really. Thembisa Fakude is a senior research fellow at Africa-Asia Dialogues. Thembisa, good afternoon to you. I mean, in a way, we shouldn't really be surprised with the situation in Cuba. The ANC has long supported Cuba. Cuba supported the ANC in other liberation movements. We can go back to the Battle of Cuito Carnaval in Angola in the 1980s. I would imagine President Ramaphosa was always going to use this kind of setting to make this kind of plea to lift the sanctions against Cuba.
Well, yeah, it's expected. The ANC has maintained its solidarity with the people of Cuba, Western Sahara and Palestine. So it was expected that he was going to talk about Cuba. But of course, one would have expected him to also emphasize or amplify the urgent matter at the moment, particularly that of the Palestinian people as they continue to face bombardment from the Israeli warplanes. And that was not mentioned. So the low-hanging and the easy one was Cuba and, of course, Zimbabwe.
Do you think the US is listening? I mean, the Cuban blockade in the United States is a very big political issue. There's a big group of people from Cuba there. It gets tied up in politics. And the obvious point is it hasn't really worked. I mean, the same government is still in charge in Cuba.
Well, Barack Obama did a lot in terms of lifting those sanctions and opening up discussions and dialogue between the Americans and Cuba. And Donald Trump came in and reversed all of that. So I think President Cyril Ramaphosa is hoping that with President Biden that those negotiations will be resuscitated. As I've said, it's a low-hanging, it lands on a much more listening ear from the current U.S. administration because of the initiatives that are taken by the Barack Obama's administration. So one hopes, of course, that, is just basically trying to remind Joe Biden that it was the position of the Democrats that initiated those discussions with the Cubans.
And the situation in Zimbabwe, I mean, ZANU-PF still in charge there. The sanctions were first imposed against the Mugabe government. President Emerson Mnangagwa is in charge now. And this is also a sort of hot-button issue. I mean, the Zimbabwean government talks about this all the time. Is our president right to say that these sanctions, the sort of supposed to be targeted sanctions, are having a big impact on the Zimbabwean economy?
Well, the president is disappointed. A lot of Zimbabweans who feel very short-changed and continue to be oppressed by their own government. The last elections were condemned by both the European Union and the SADC observer missions in that country. The intimidation, oppression, and suppression of basic rights continue in Zimbabwe. And one would have hoped, of course, that South Africa was going to at least cease to be the foot soldier or the lobbyist on behalf of the oppressive regime of Zimbabwe. But what we see happening is that Cyril Ramaphosa, of course, being tone deaf in terms of the calls by the Zimbabwe civil society that the regime of Minister Mnangagwa deserves to be punished for its continual oppression of people there. There you are, President of South Africa, going to the United Nations, notwithstanding what has happened before and after these elections, calling for the world to, particularly the United States, to lift those sanctions against Zimbabwe, which is still seen by its own people as an oppressive government.
It's very interesting to try and watch our government's reaction and almost the ANC's reaction to the elections in Zimbabwe. Because it seems our government is almost going against SADC. I mean, President Ramaphosa went to the inauguration of President Mnangagwa, and only 3 other leaders from Africa actually went. I mean, that was quite a big thing for him to do, considering the outcry.
Indeed, I mean, 17 South African SADC president, 3 of them went. In other words, the rest snubbed the invitation by Emmerson Mnangagwa. And you have President Cyril Ramaphosa, who comfortably went to Zimbabwe. He didn't have to go, but of course that was followed by strong statements and rhetoric that came from the ANC itself, which was represented by Fikile Mbalula in Zimbabwe, emphasizing the relationship and the ongoing workings between the ANC and ZANU-PF. So it is, of course, disappointing. And one would have hoped that, notwithstanding that there's been calls to continue putting pressure on Emmerson Mnangagwa, President Cyril Ramaphosa at least would have scratched out the solidarity statement that he made at the UNGA.
The United Nations General Assembly, it's very interesting because it's a very important gathering, and the United Nations is still really the best tool that we have to try and resolve disputes between nations. There are calls for reform. It doesn't seem that there's going to be much reform of the United Nations, particularly while Russia and Ukraine are still involved in this conflict and Russia's invasion continues. And yet we also have some of the leaders of the big countries, some of the countries with vetoes, permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, not even bothering themselves to come to the General Assembly meeting. What does that tell us?
Oh, it tells us that nobody takes the United Nations General Assembly very serious. It is more and more becoming a big talk shop where people go and vent. For a very long time, it was a comical theater for people such as Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, and Robert Mugabe. So they don't really take it serious. But President Cyril Ramaphosa, of course, sees it as an important platform through which he can go and lobby for the inclusion in the United Nations Security Council, which is the multilateral that they've been talking about. And that, again, is problematic because, pushing for the inclusion of South Africa on the United Nations Security Council means that South Africa is basically going to be deciding on who lives and who dies.
And our role at the moment, in a way, we see we're part of BRICS, we're part of the United States program of AGOA. We get a voice at some of these things. It seems to me that South Africa is almost in a very interesting place at the moment. Lots of people seem to want our attention, maybe because we're a country that could change its mind one way or another on all of these big questions.
Well, we're just punching way above our weight. I don't think one should be pushing for inclusion in multilateral platforms. But again, there's nothing wrong with us being part of the G77, G20 and BRICS. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. But the attitude, of course, of the world is that they are trying to dim the limelight on South Africa. The fact that President Cyril Ramaphosa was snapped in Hiroshima during the G7 meeting. And secondly, now you've got the African Union being an additional member of G20 for a very long time. President Cyril Ramaphosa was the only African leader within the G20. Now we've got African Union. So you can see the attitude of the other countries towards South Africa. So whilst it's important for us to be sitting on all of these platforms, I think the interest on South Africa is slowly declining.
Thembisa Fakude, thank you. Senior Research Fellow at Africa-Asia Dialogues. You can see his favorite newspaper behind him. Really appreciate the time.